Thank you so much for joining us today for Pitt Perspectives on the Future of Work, the New Hybrid Workplace. The COVID-19 pandemic forced many of us to figure out how to work remotely for health and safety purposes. Now that restrictions are lifting, everyone's talking about this concept of a hybrid workplace. Today's panelists will help us unpackage this concept, talk about the opportunities and challenges it presents, and of course, answer some questions from our audience. Joining us today are Rory Cooper, Director, Human Engineering Research Laboratories, Jean Ferketish, Pitt alumna and Associate Professor Emeritus, School of Education, David Lebel, Associate Professor of Business Administration, and Lauren Wright, Pitt alumna, doctoral candidate, and Director of Undergraduate Recruitment. On behalf of the Pitt Alumni Association, thank you all for being here today. Before we jump into questions, I want to point out a couple things. First, in the interest of time, we'll be sharing a link to our panelists' bios in the chat. So please feel free to take a look and get a sense of the breadth of experience represented by our panelists today. Second, throughout our session today, you can feel free to pose a question to a particular panelist or to our panel at large by using the Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screen. Click the Q&A button, a new window will pop up and you just submit your question right there. We'll get to as many of the questions as we possibly can today. With that, let's go ahead and get started. My first question I'm going to give to David. David, what are you learning through your research about people's transition to remote work? And is remote work a reality of our future?
Thanks, Nancy. Appreciate you inviting me on this panel and getting to talk about this important topic today. So Nancy referred to some research I did here at Pitt. We interviewed a bunch of staff in the middle of the pandemic last summer. So May, June, and July. We got a couple thousand responses from staff all over the university. So we got a pretty wide sample. And we were asking about how they were adapting at work, and we've learned quite a bit. We have multiple projects going, but in terms of this remote work and this question, we've learned that people are kind of two opinions, or at least two opinions. Some people really like it. As alums, you can all remember trying to find parking in Oakland. A lot of staff do not miss having to commute in, dealing with bridges and tunnels, and also paying for parking. So we got a lot of comments in some of our qualitative data saying, like, I love this. I prefer not to have to commute on a daily basis. It's taken a lot of stress out of my life. It's added a lot of time for family and other things. On the other side, you have people who are saying this is not sustainable, whether it's because kids are at home for school, whether it's because not enough resources, not enough space at home. I had multiple people comment, we're all at home and we don't have extra rooms, so we're all working over a dinner table. So like everyone's situation was quite different. And that will, that's one big thing we learned, is that people are split and everyone's situation is different. And that points to like a second theme that we found, is that flexibility. Like, I think there's going to be a big onus on managers and leaders to understand and to not make assumptions, and to understand how flexible they need to be, and need to clearly communicate expectations for whatever hybrid structure or non-hybrid structure you set up going forward. And the third thing is that supervisors, middle management are going to be extremely important. A lot of employees are nervous, or were nervous, and I think are nervous about these flexible work arrangements. We found that supervisors did a lot to buffer that anxiety and to make people more optimistic about all of these changes. We found that for middle managers, supervisors, and also leaders who are able to better communicate what's happening. So I'm not someone who's into the details of exactly what the hybrid workplace is going to look like, but I think leaders and managers are going to spend a lot of time thinking about how to communicate this and how to share how they've adapted to make it easier on the employees.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that. Next question will go to Rory. As a faculty member who does more hands-on research, what considerations are important for research institutions and other employers to make as they consider a changing workforce? Oh, you're on mute.
So one of the things, you know, a major research institution like Pittsburgh has to consider is that our physical resources are one of the things that makes us a world-class research institution in many ways, and draws students to come and work with us. And so, you know, there are people that the equipment and the laboratories that they use, and in some cases, you know, laboratory animals are essential to their research, and then they need to be there in person. And so we have to think about the roles of the individual. Also, science is done more and more in teams. And while, you know, there are benefits to remote work, and you can expand the size of teams, and it could be global teams, there are to meeting face to face in a room and, you know, having a whiteboard or projecting on the screen or sitting around a computer together and discussing things that work better. And so and there are some things, you know, we're not going to have remote virology labs, for example, in the near future, and laboratory animals are not currently able to take care of themselves, and we haven't got, you know, automated systems to take care of them. And sophisticated machinery takes people to take care of them as well. So those things are, you know, of a top tier research institution like the University of Pittsburgh that make us unique. Students come here also to learn how to learn those techniques and learn to work with that equipment and learn with the faculty and staff who operate that equipment. And so I think that's also important. So it's really going to be a matter of supervisors and working with the members of their team to optimize whether it's working remotely or working on site or some combination thereof, which will help best fulfill the mission of the organization, and hopefully help meet the goals of the individual as well.
Wonderful, thanks, Rory. So playing off of that a little bit, Jean, for you, Rory just talked a little bit about how some people simply cannot work remotely, right? Can you talk a little bit about human interaction and what roles or work you think will move to a fully remote status in the future?
Okay, one of the things I like to start out with by just saying is that we're all experts in human communications. We do it every day. What we don't have is language and framework to think about it. As I think about remote work, one of the things I think is important in the human interactions is to think about what type of interaction I have. If I think about a continuum, and one end is the transactional interaction. We all know that the help desks and the order centers are knocking the socks off of that. I mean, gee, you know, we can order anything, we can get a help desk, we can fix anything. If I go up to the complexity portion of that continuum, now that's where it starts getting a little bit tougher. You know, during this pandemic, I've talked with people in very different professions. For example, my friends who are therapists, they have told me that what they are seeing is that as long as they know the patient, they can do the sessions. What they can't do is they wonder how the startup meetings are going to be happening, because that's where you start really getting into the depth of it. I've colleagues who are architects. When they're doing a drawing in the silence and they want the introverted aspect of doing a drawing in architecture, they want that. They can do that remotely. But when they're in a room and they need to really pound out the pros and cons of the drawing, they can't do that remotely at all, because that's creativity. The other thing that I think about is how do we really start learning to use the software? I don't know if any of you have been exposed to the software Mural, but that is an incredibly powerful, powerful tool. And having used it with multiple teams, it really breaks through a lot of these creativity barriers. There's a very simple tool called Nearpod. That tool helps you can learn that in 2 seconds. You know, it's designed for elementary schools There's a higher ed section in it, but I've used it with multiple teams, healthcare teams, and they pick it up very, very quickly, and we get into brainstorming and it works out beautifully. What I miss, and I will challenge you all to help me learn about this, is how do we pick up the vibe? You know, I don't know how to do that. You know, I asked a person, a young man who's an engineer, how he picks up the vibe at work. And he told me, well, he can pick up his boss's vibe in a minute. When he comes in the room and slams down the folder, he knows he's in a bad mood. I thought, well, I was hoping for something a little more subtle. You know, when you go in and you can tell that something's going on, people are down, people are really happy, there's a tension in the room. All of that I can't pick up on Zoom. And I never realized until this pandemic how much I depended on that. So I'm going to end there and say that the human communications aspect is difficult. We need to talk about it directly and what makes sense for your team and the kind of work you do.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren, when the panelists met to prepare for this session, you brought up a point about hybrid work and thinking about it in two different ways. You know, one being, you know, this cultural shift that needs to happen, but also thinking about hybrid work as a staff benefit. And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate for us a little more today on that. And then tell us which do you think will be more commonly, or which will more commonly emerge in the next several years?
Yes, thank you for that question. So the research that I'm doing is actually on managers and the multi-generational workforce. So it aligns perfectly with what David was referencing. And one of the things, the number one thing across generations, the number one workplace value is flexibility. So this remote work is something that seems to be fairly universally accepted across 4 generations of staff, maybe even 5 once we know more about Generation Z. But the number one issue, to Jean's point, is communication. And that tends to be what creates the most source of conflict. And so these two things sort of butt heads, for lack of a better term, wanting to be flexible, but also making sure that communication doesn't suffer. And so I think that ultimately guides where people make the decisions about whether they are going to lean toward making a culture shift or articulating something benefit. So from the culture shift perspective, you're talking mindset shifts, long-term. That's not necessarily something you could have done quickly. Organizations were forced into a quick fix due to the pandemic, but maybe they would have thought about it more or done more research. Benefits allows us to try new things. From a management perspective, it says, why not? Let's be a little bit more flexible. Let's let people work from home, see what happens. We don't like it, we can take it back. So that goes into the idea of, is it an expectation? When you have a culture shift, it's, we work remotely. I supervise a staff where 10 individuals work remotely. They don't get punished by being brought back to Pittsburgh if their performance declines, right? So it is just part of their expectations, and it's not a perk that we're using to either recruit staff or retain staff. And so that really makes a difference. The other big piece, I think, between culture and benefit is within culture, the onus for success is on the company. So that means they have to provide resources. They may have to provide new spaces. If you treat it as a benefit, it's what space do you have at home? Do you have a good chair? Do you have a good desk? If you want to continue working from home, you provide that for yourself. So I think that does make it more difficult for organizations to decide on the culture shift side, because they have to change those mindsets. It's a new way of doing business. It's maybe more resources. It could be high risk, going back to the points made by several panelists, is what work can we get done? What work can't we get done? And what didn't we get to try out before deciding on a shift that was really just necessitated by pandemic, whereas a benefit is a lot more low risk, more minimal resources. So if I were to speculate, I would guess, at least initially and probably for a few years, particularly in academia, which tends to move a little bit more slowly, it's going to be treated as a benefit, right? Until organizations can see, is this something we want to adapt, and can find the resources to really make that shift a reality, if it seems like they will be able to maintain their functions and their communication, to the points made by several different panelists.
So playing off of that a little bit, Jean, back to you. If hybrid work requires a culture shift, who will we see leading this change at organizations? And what are the key first steps in leading change at a cultural level?
I think that back to one of the things that Lauren was saying is it a benefit or is it a cultural shift? From the cultural shift perspective, I would say what's driving the change to hybrid? Because now it's no longer necessary. What's driving it? In one regard, you could say what's driving it is that we can free up office space, either reduce cost or just have less crowding in the office. On another side, I could say, hey, the benefit to me, a driver of change for me would be to reduce my commute time. When we communicate about these shifts, really understanding the drivers, help you understand what the culture shift needs to be. The other thing we want to pull into focus is, who do I serve in my work? You know, in industry and business, they would talk about the internal customer and the customer chain until we get to the external customer. Customer wording doesn't work well in every kind of situation like healthcare. It certainly doesn't work in education, but the really focus on who do I serve? What do they need from me? And now my work design, not only what I do, but where I do it, I need to be thinking about what benefits the overall process, what benefits that organization. It's that and that end user. It's also a benefit for me. That could be one of the drivers. But as I communicate, if I want remote work, what I would encourage people not to do is lead with heavy personal drivers. I remember years ago, a young person came to me and wanted to go to a 4-day work week so that there would be more time to do the laundry and household chores. Okay, that was a heavy benefit oriented, but it didn't appeal to me as a leader. Now, if that person had come to me and had more elder care issues they were dealing with, things like that, I would have probably been listening a lot better. If they came to me and they were talking about, gee, the commute, now I can hear it better. Okay, but if they come to me and they talk about, you know, if I have 2 days a week at home, I can really concentrate on paperwork better. I can do the reports and the scenarios. I can write the case studies. I can do this better if I have uninterrupted work to do it. Now, as a leader in an organization, I'm really listening. So as you move down this scale about who's driving the culture change, the leadership of the organization obviously is leading that culture change. But people who want to see the benefit of it, they need to really keep connected to the organizational needs as they communicate what the flexibility is that they need. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jane. Rory, hopping back to you, what opportunities and challenges are presented to employees with disabilities when they're able or required to work from home? Oh, you're on mute.
There are both pluses and minuses, right? And so some of the real benefits are that you know, if you have your support system is in place at wherever your home is, and so you add access to healthcare, you know, having the flexibility that you might need to be able to accommodate your impairments. Those are all certainly benefits. You know, you can actually set up in sort of an idealized work environment in many ways, right? All the equipment. Now, but some of the challenges are who would provide the accessibility modifications. So the typical workplace, that's a workplace accommodation. So they have to be decided, is this a workplace accommodation or do you have to provide those yourself? And Is that provided by the employer, or is it provided by some third party, like the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation in many cases? The others, there's some, but the other one is also geographic preferences. And you could work, for example, for the University of Pittsburgh, but not even live in Pennsylvania, because that might be where your support system is. So you could actually have a more employees with disabilities because they could stay closer to where their support systems, for example, where their family is, or where their friends are that support them, or where there's more availability of accessible housing, for example. And then, of course, there's the other challenges. You have to have access to high-speed internet, for example, in most cases, right? And so that does limit you a little bit. You can see from some of the current demographic shifts that have just happened because of COVID-19. Some people with disabilities have moved back to be closer to their families, because it's easier for them to live and to work in those environments than it might be where they need to be for employment. So they're not necessarily aligned. Of course, and people without disabilities are moving to some areas that just might be more desirable for raising families and for other lifestyle choices, and they can do that if they can work remotely. Some of the challenges are, though, adequate computer, the accessibility of that computer, the software, and then there's the whole software security issue. For example, a lot of research done at the University of Pittsburgh requires FISMA compliance. And FISMA is basically a federal law for security. You're not likely to have that at home. Now, it can be addressed. There are government employees and other private sector employers that require high levels of data safety and data. And so, that might require the university then, though, to provide a computer, provide all the access equipment, provide a cell phone, and actually even provide the internet connectivity so that it can be remotely upgraded, remotely security updates could be done, allow people to work from work. And then the other question we have in research is, it's very important that we protect people's private information that we collect during research. And so if you're, that's a little easier if everybody's in the office on campus, because you can have, or in the office per se, even in a corporate situation, because you can have an IT staff, right? Your information technology staff, make sure that they put on patches, and which could be both accessibility patches and security patches. If everybody's working remotely, then you have to be able to basically operate remote networks and provide that, both that level of accessibility and security. And they kind of go hand in hand, because you can push out a security update that then disables an accessibility update. And so you have to be careful about that as well. So that's something that you have to learn really as both providers of employment and people who are employed. So it's not just about whether you can work remotely or work on site. The structures of that have to change as well. And the other thing that's interesting for people with disabilities is, depending on what state you live in, your benefits vary and your tax structure varies. And so like the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation benefits vary from state to state. And your tax benefits vary from state to state. And so that one is that would make interesting challenges for our payroll and benefits system for the university or for other employers. But it also could be interesting because people with disabilities might choose, if they had the opportunity, to choose in the state that provides favorable benefits for them, right? And what if they could, but then have an employer that might be located in a different state. So I think the other thing too is that, but I do think that having hybrid work and remote work opportunities could be a tremendous benefit for people with disabilities, because the transportation is a significant barrier for individuals with disabilities, or many individuals with disabilities. And so if we can eliminate that as a barrier, or reduce it as a barrier, that opens up opportunities. The other opportunity is I'll out myself here, is that a lot of your listeners probably don't realize that I myself am a person with disability, and I use a wheelchair for mobility, and you can't tell that in this environment. And so in some ways that opens up doors too, because it can make it possible for people to show their talents and their abilities without having people's pre-perceived notions be an impact. So I think it's an exciting, that's why I think the hybrid and flexible is something that I don't think we have a choice. COVID has caused a grand experiment on a global scale, and we know that it can work. We've exposed some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. So I think at this point going forward, what we really need to look at is how best do we optimize a hybrid work and make them more inclusive, right? Not only for people with disabilities, but it's important for women and childcare, people of color, and people that might have family in other countries, and allow them that flexibility as well, right?
Yeah, that's great perspective, Rory, and building off of your latest comment about building inclusive environments as well, or workplaces. So some of the reading I've been doing lately has been talking about the hybrid workplace and potentially anticipating bias in promotion, right? So the people that might be more willing or able to be in the office, people maybe younger, without families, other responsibilities, more men, because what we're finding and surveying too, it sounds like, and Dave, you can confirm this, is that it seems like more women are opting out of return to the office. How that then might skew promotions and moving up the career ladder as well, because presumably the people who are there and visible and front of mind are the ones who will kind of automatically get promoted, whereas people who out of sight, out of mind, right? People who are working more remote hours might be at a disadvantage. And so I'm curious to get any of our panelists' opinions on that, if you think that's a valid concern, and then what can workplaces do to help alleviate that? Dave, do you want to? Yeah.
I can jump in quickly. I mean, the research on who gets promoted is pretty clear. It's, obviously competent people who do their jobs well, but informal networks is a huge portion of that. So to your point, I'd be worried about unintended consequences about who's going to get promoted, because the people who aren't going to be able to make those connections at work, right? And so if you are working remotely, and this kind of goes to something that I found fascinating, what Jean said about communication, most of what we retain and take from others, over 90% is body language and verbal tone, and Zoom kind of takes care of that. But even when, like Jean was talking, I kind of wanted to say something, but without being in the room, I can't tell if she's really open. Can I interrupt her? If I'm in the room, I could say, okay, I think there's a slight pause. Maybe I'll be able to, because I'm directing at her, and I could also communicate, hey, I'm not interrupting you. I'm trying to enhance what you're saying. And it's very difficult to do that over Zoom. And so I worry about what's going to get lost. So most of communication is going to get lost. I think it's going to have big implications for promotion. And one other thing I forgot to say at the intro, is I think we're thinking about this, or many people can jump to binary thinking. In this case, I mean, you're either a hybrid remote 5 days a week, or you're in work 5 days a week. And I think it's along a continuum, because if I'm talking to young employees, there's no way I'm going to advise that you should be out of the office 5 days a week for these other reasons, right? You need to make a connection. You need to see what people are thinking, build a bond with your team, because we know so much about work that those informal networks matter. So you have to do that. And so I don't think we should be thinking about this as a binary yes, no. There's a continuum that people need to think about. And that's what I would recommend for kind of easing some of these issues on promotion. But if I was working 5 days a week remotely, I'd be concerned that I might not have the shot that I normally would for being promoted.
I'd agree with that. I think that's what I meant by hybrid, is both in the office, some of the office some of the time and remote some of the time. And of course, the other advantage of sort of hybrid is that you can be more global as well, right? You can have global collaborators. You can expand your network. I mean, I think there's still advantage to face-to-face, even in a global, right? I'd hate to see it universities say that we're not going to go to conferences anymore and meet people face-to-face, just because it's hard to build relationships with people just via video conferencing. But it is a way to stay connected in between in some ways as well. So, as Jean said, one of the things that is important is maintaining those people skills, or developing people skills, depending on where you are in your career scale.
One of the things that I would build on what both Rory and Dave were saying is that face time counts, relationships count. And so the question becomes, how do I build those relationships? I think this is a new role for leaders. And I like that when Dave used earlier in the conversation, you talked about supervisors, managers, and leaders, which starts you understanding the tiers of the organization. In talking to colleagues again during this area, because I was just so fascinated with how are people doing this, there's a lot of very cool ideas that are happening up there. I have one colleague with her department. What she's doing is she puts everybody's name in a hat, pulls it out, and they have to have coffee for a half hour once a week, different people every week, and they're not allowed to talk about work. Now that sounds very, very mechanistic, but we need that now because we don't have those informal coffee pot conversations anymore. So the leadership needs to, number one, how do I get these ideas? How do we share these ideas? And then how do I step forward and start implementing them in my department, even when it makes me feel like a dork, because it's going to feel that way. And what I need to do is I just need to suck it up and implement these things that are more mechanical, because it will help with the communications.
So when I start doing that with my team, I'm going to say, Jean said I can do this, and feel like a dork. Well, I think that's great. I'm going to go ahead and get to some of our audience questions, if that's all right. Paula Young wrote, and this is not so much a question as a comment, but I think, Lauren, you want to elaborate on this a little more. Paula Young wrote, I think the messaging around benefit is likely a generational difference as well. I find millennials and other non-boomers actually value work-life balance and want to work for places that support that. Being able to do laundry, staying healthy, etc., are also cultural values, and organizations may want to start recognizing those as ways for people to bring their full selves to the work.
Yeah, so I wanted to touch upon that because I absolutely agree. I think that's definitely one of the challenges. When we talk about a cultural shift, it's more in the realm of expectations. So this is a workplace that supports remote work, which means that part of our culture is those coffee discussions that Jean was talking about. And part of our culture is quick 10-minute check-ins via Teams. It's not something that requires you to physically be in the space all of the time, because we've made adjustments as an organization. When remote work is thought of as a benefit, there tends to be a language around, you need to prove yourself to me or justify why this makes sense, right? So for certain generations, absolutely, they see it as, you allowing me to work in a hybrid environment is why I come to your organization, or what keeps me. It's not something that you're giving me on top of that benefit. And so in that regard, right, they don't feel as pressured to say, it doesn't matter what happens on that fourth day, whether I do laundry, I walk my dog all day, I binge watch a TV show. I would like the flexibility of a 4-day, even 10 hours a day work week, because that's something I expect to see in culture. And so that's one of the things that does make it a lot more challenging, because what is happening, so to give you an idea, at Pitt, around 60% of our workforce is now millennials, but our leadership tends to still be baby boomer leadership. So those cultural values tend to align a little bit more with that, despite the majority transitioning into being a different generation. And that does create challenges and sort of misnomers when it comes to the conversation of particularly this topic of work-life balance, as more and more organizations, particularly millennial-friendly organizations, Silicon Valley, things like that, remote, hybrid, they're natural occurrences. They're not something that is this attracts me to this environment on top of the other things that attracts me, as much as it is us taking a pivot in something that tends to be much more in person, like higher education.
So building off of that, recruitment and retention of employees. I think I know the answer to this, but I'll pose it to the group anyways. If an employer is, for whatever reason, unable, unwilling to entertain this hybrid concept, what will that mean for recruitment and retention of employees?
I don't want to hog all the talking time. I'll pass it over to you, Jean. I'll say really quickly, it's likely going to mean turnover, depending on who you're trying to recruit. I can say for my generation, the millennial generation, but also, right, research shows Gen X in particular also wants that flexibility, because they tend to value that time outside of work for family more than other generations, particularly as individuals who grew up as children of divorce very commonly, latchkey kids very commonly. That is something that now that the world has opened to that possibility, there are people looking for that at the top of their list, is hybrid work, flexible work, and that will make recruitment harder for individual or for organizations that don't adapt to that, and retention harder now that more people have seen this seems to be effective, and I like the benefits that come with being able to work remotely.
And I would take that one step further. In the job negotiations, I would be asking directly about my startup package as the remote worker. Then minor things, which I don't understand how this works now, but how do all the office supplies work? Do you, when I was recently, just a couple of weeks ago out in Seattle, and they're way far out on the edge. Some of our listeners might live out there, but you know, everyone that I saw, they had stand-up desks that the companies had delivered to their homes. They had all kinds of supplies at their homes. They had headphones that were supplied. You know, there was nothing that these people were purchasing themselves. The paper that they needed was provided. So, you know, I think there'll be more efficient ways to do that in the future. But I do think that wondering what your startup package will be to support your home office will be a question you want to ask. I also think that what I was saying before when I talked about the laundry, we're still going to be selling across generations. And so when I sell my boss because I want something, I'm going to speak the language that influences that person.
But I think in the future or going forward, when we do job announcement, when we create positions, we're not going to create, is this a remote position, a hybrid position, or on-site position? And then we'll have to clearly state in the job so that people apply for jobs that they understand. So there, like we said earlier, there are some jobs you have to be here. That, you know, it's a hands-on equipment job that, you know, we're not going to set up a $10 million or $50 million lab in everybody's home, and most homes couldn't even accommodate that anyways. And there's you know, that's the type of job it is, right? And we'll have to figure out how to compensate. You might have to pay for parking in the future, because if you've got enough people that are working remotely or hybrid, that, you know, the person that says that I've got to come to campus, I should be compensated for that, right? But I think the key to do is communicate up front. Here's what we're looking for, and then people know what they can negotiate within, right? So if you're applying for an on-site job, then you know what you know the realm. If you're applying for a hybrid, you can maybe discuss, how often you have to come in. Is it 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week?
You make a good point on that. That's very similar to what people do now with travel schedule. This job requires 20% travel and some weekend work. That would be the same type of thing. It's a good insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think Rory's point about the formal job descriptions, that's like absolutely must have those types of, is it in the middle, all in person, all remote. And for going back to managers and leaders, their job's going to be harder because the good managers are also going to think about informal job negotiations, informal job previews. Okay, so this posting says mostly remote, but I'm just going to tell you, you're going to be working with me and my team. We like to get to know each other. So we expect that it's going to be a little bit more in person than what this, this says. And communicating, it goes back to the culture questions earlier, that the good leaders and managers are going to have to be very open. They have to first think about what their expectations are, what those expectations mean, and explain why they're important. You can't just say these are the expectations. Otherwise, you're going to lose people, right? But here are the expectations and why it's so important for this work that you are here more so you can build these relationships. And I think that'll be a big thing. And another thing, building on something that Jean said about the office supplies, I have this headset because I was lucky enough to do a podcast and they sent it to me. That wasn't Pitt, but everything else, my budget was cut in half as a faculty member, and that's, I think for most of the business school, but I still had enough money to buy, I have a camera, a light that you can see, I have a camera. When I did the study, most staff said, I don't have anything. I'm doing this on my own, and it's not clear whether I can get reimbursed. So I know I can be reimbursed. So my larger point is organizations have to think about these disparities because there's going to be a lot of opportunities where these disparities can get wider. And this is another one. There's so promotion is one, and what resources people have is another. So how can you get these resources out to all levels? Because I think, high level and staff, I think, it's going to be an easy one because the high level people are going to complain more. It's going to be my guess, so.
Thanks for that, Dave. So getting back to our audience questions, and Casavan is asking, what about training and professional development opportunities, especially for young people? So I think the inference here is in a hybrid or remote environment, maybe it's more challenging to get those professional development opportunities. Does anyone want to volunteer to take this one?
I'll get us started.
Yeah.
When I think about professional development opportunities, I sort of think about it from 3 different angles. One is the cognitive piece, one is the relationships I build when I'm there, and then one's the personal growth area. So that if I think about the cognitive stuff, hey, give me any topic and within, a couple hours, I can sound like an expert in it, thanks to our friend Google. Okay, so the cognitive issue isn't, but as Rory, it's not an issue, but as Rory said earlier, how do you go about building those relationships? And then a lot of personal development, especially as you go through leadership training, has to do with very specific feedback on your own personal style. I can't imagine doing that by Zoom at all. If you think about personal growth workshops where you're in a group setting, you're interacting with people, and then people sit down and the group provides feedback to each other on their personal interactions. I mean, that's how a lot of leadership development occurs. How do you do that on Zoom? I don't know the answer. So I think that people need to be smart consumers about professional development and really see what do they want out of it and then go for it that way. What about others? What are other things that people thinking on this topic?
Yeah, so we've leaned very heavily on webinars and opportunities to interact with staff, again, via Zoom. We used to be Skype. So our office has had remote workers for the past about 6 years now. So it's been a little bit different as we've had to adapt a lot of our spaces to accommodate. There's like an owl that we use so that you can view presentations that are being given live via your computer. And so adapting the technology for those professional development opportunities. Within the realm of training, again, it's hybrid. I think, David has mentioned several times the role of the manager and the leader, and it is harder at the end of the day to constantly keep in your mind that within a hybrid environment, you have to change the way that you communicate a lot of these things, and you have to be open to a lot of other opportunities. And there are still some limitations. One that we have seen is, of course, taking advantage of coursework. So we have Pitt employees who are not able to take advantage of the staff benefit because prior to Flex at Pitt, they weren't able to take coursework on Pitt's campus. We still have not resolved what that would look like. We look for other opportunities, of course, but there are challenges, and that's definitely not something to be overlooked when you're thinking about a remote or a hybrid environment.
The one thing I was just going to say again to build on, Jean's great comments was, this is from the employee perspective. We know proactivity, and this is the research I do, proactivity leads to a lot of career success, and that's going to be the same case here with skill building, right? And so what you want to do is be proactive in thinking about those three categories. I think it was cognitive, relation, and I forgot the third, but you can go be proactive to search for things in terms of content on Google right now. There's no reason any employee shouldn't be doing that. You're gonna need to spend a little bit more time thinking about how can I build those relationships, and maybe that's where you schedule that coffee, like Nancy was mentioning, with your boss, and say, hey, I'm struggling here. I'm trying to meet people in this new environment. It's really hard. Do you have advice, right? And that's a way, just for 5 to 10 minutes to have quick informal conversations to build those relationships. But it's going to be, I mentioned that it's going to be harder for managers and supervisors, but I think it's going to be the proactive employees who start to pull ahead in this new hybrid environment. We already know that proactive individuals have an advantage in terms of career success. That gap might widen too, because if, there are a lot of seminars you can go to all the time, and those should stay. The question is, where do the relationships come in? I think that's our gap, right? And Jean's mentioned that several times, so I'm just going to keep hammering that home for her. What are we going to do in this hybrid environment to build those relationships?
And
well, also, Jean mentioned something. There's a huge technology investment that's going to need to be made, because if you're talking about now hybrid classrooms, hybrid conference rooms, because right now we haven't really gone hybrid, except in a few cases, right? There's people that had to stay on campus, like some of my people, the entire time, but a lot of people have actually gone remote. And when you have people that are on campus and off campus working together, like Lauren, like Lauren's office has been, then you need to have that owl in the room, right? And then you need to be out there. The people in the room need to be conscious about the fact that there are people that are not in the room that need to be participating. It's I'm sure all of us have had experience in the past with teleconferences, right? So you've had people sitting in the room, and you've had the conference speakerphone sitting in the conference for the people that are remote. And it's been very difficult it's always difficult for those people to get a chance to say anything, right? Because they don't have the body language. There's always a little delay. You only see a box, so they can't give body language signals. That's another, we have to learn, we have to have better technology, but we also have to learn how to use it appropriately so that there's an equal playing field for people that are remote versus people who are on site.
Yeah, and the only one thing I wanted to add, just as a piece of advice for managers that I've learned from a lot of remote supervision, is that your calendar has to be very accurate and transparent, because when you're working remotely, you don't know, like you can't walk past your boss's office to see if they're in there, to David's points and to Jean's points about those relationships and building that social capital. So if your calendars are accurate, yes, you're still going to have to be that proactive employee. I 100% agree, but at least it's, I see you have 20 minutes later in the afternoon. Can I catch up with you? And it's not your manager saying, that wasn't a real 20 minutes. I'm actually going to be out picking up my kids, right? There are things that you do have to adjust if you are accommodating your workplace for that hybrid model.
Goes the other way around too. You could be in the office. It happens to me all the time. People knock on my door, and I'm in a meeting like this, right? So they think I'm just at my computer, but I'm, and can I bother you for a few minutes? And, well, for all I know, I could be talking, I could be talking to important people like Gene. So, and then they wind up in your background, right?
Right. One of the things that this conversation is spurring to me, and this goes back to something Lauren said earlier, is how do you hold people accountable? For example, as I reflect on this whole area of remote learning and my experience in the past year in my leadership, I kind of wondered, gee, I wasn't that good of a leader. But, I used to do so much informal drop-ins, and Dave talked about that. I used to pick up the vibe of people so often. And a lot of this was intuitive and informal. And, obviously you hold people accountable because they have deadlines to meet. You do a lot of coaching conversations between the beginning of a project and an end of a project, so you kind of know how it's going. And you could still do that remotely. You can also tell if somebody is just like not active at work, they're slacking off. You got a slacker in the office. And I just wonder about how that will work and how that will play out. I wonder about, one of the things people always, on the other side of things, I worry about overwork. So many people that I have talked to during this period of time talk about all their cues of it's time to end the day has gone. They don't exist anymore. So the fact that people are like getting up and saying goodbye, all these cues, and they just keep working and working and working. And all of a sudden they realize they put in a 10-hour day. So how is that going to manage? So I think that this balance of life, and I think that Lauren spoke so eloquently to that earlier, is going to be an issue. And again, it's only going to be manageable through communications.
And those are the two things I would, again, building on Gene's great comments. I mean, if I was a manager or leader, I'd be focusing on two dimensions. You can focus on so many things, but you have to simplify it to some extent. Flexibility and accountability. Like how am I doing? And obviously you want to get to high flexibility, high accountability. And so, what does that look like? So is it, if we're using MS Teams, are there certain hours where I need you to be there, so that I can ping you? So I can't drop by your office anymore, but if I need something done quickly, you need to be there. And maybe it goes back to managing your schedule calendar. What are the prime time hours? When does the workday stop? What are the expectations for responding to emails in the evening? One good thing about kids at home is I know when my day's over, right? It's about 5:30 and they've had enough and they're like, keep knocking. Okay. I mean, but if they're not there, I had this because they were gone for a few days, like where it's like 8 o'clock. It's like, oh, am I still at my screen? So anyway, we're going to have to do this work-life balance thing and figure that out. But you really have to balance flexibility and accountability. And to me, it goes back to managers and leaders clearly articulating, here's when I need you to be on and not. And going back to disparities, I think managers are going to lean on those people who do a lot of work. They're going to get burnt out. And again, good leaders are going to figure out how to farm their work out to a whole team and not forget about people. Otherwise, we're just going to see burnout, because I'm just going to keep going to those top two people and give them assignments because I know they respond. But what about the rest of your team? You can't just let them go by the wayside. So anyway, I think it's going to take some time to figure out those norms and communication patterns.
So we are approaching the end of our hour, but I thought I'd ask one final question. Again, playing off this this concept of, I think, all the questions that this concept of hybrid work brings up. I think you said this, Dave, the brunt of those most impacted to influence this are the managers, right? And so Carolyn Kesavan asked another question about what are some of the challenges managers and supervisors are facing in getting results from people working at home, and how do they deal with people who are not producing? And so wanted to pose that to you all and see what opinions you have.
But I think we have to move away from, looking at, it's going to be important for supervisors to understand what products need to be delivered and in what timeline. And then, and that's what we're going to be focused on rather than hours worked or days of the, when those hours are worked. I do think that actually university have been, they've been famous for decades for having sort of flexibility in hours anyways, especially among faculty, and it's to some regard just a lot of staff as well. But it really, we're going to wind up, I think, being more outcomes or product focused rather than time focused. And that means, setting clear expectations from both the supervisors and the people who work with them.
To build on that, I think that the communications will be so important there, because if you asked me to write a 10-page report, the time it takes me to do that could be days and days and days. The next person whips it out really quickly. It has to do with, I've got to research it. They have it all in their head. So that communications and coaching that goes on during the process is going to be so important to really understanding what people need, because and output is obviously what we're concerned about, but critical to that is the whole idea that it does take time to get to that output. And what does that time start like? I always say that throughout my career, I made about 50 cents an hour.
Yeah, and to second Jean's point, that's excellent, because we see the same thing. So for example, with a hybrid workplace, we do admissions committee, and you can see how many decisions people make, right? But one person might make 50 decisions in a day. And so you're thinking they couldn't have sat there for 8 hours when another person made 300 decisions in 8 hours. But it's about the pace at which they read, how do they go through the process, and they may have even been there longer. There's instances where the person who was less productive from a numerical efficiency standpoint was actually working harder, which, I mean, not to introduce a new challenge at the end of this conversation, but that does make it more difficult, and it does require you to spend as much time as you can as managers and, as Dave put it, as leaders, as getting to know your staff and being able to trust that, yeah, maybe they only did that 50 decisions, but I don't think it's because they only worked 1 hour in that day, because I've taken the time to get to know them and their dedication and their pace and all sorts of things, so that we're able to evaluate people based on who they are as individuals and not as on some just basic numeric outlier, because differences in diversity will of course exist.
Yeah, it's a great point. And sometimes you just have to make that investment in time, right? You can't get necessarily to be really fast without experience. And so you just have to realize that we're going to, you don't want to give the fast person all of the reviews. You've got to, because then your new people don't become fast people, right? And so I think that's another thing. It's about communication, and it's about the supervisors understanding there might be a trajectory there, right? But if you stay a slow person forever, that might be a conversation you have to have. But if you are sort of learning aspects of the job and it therefore takes you a while longer, then that has to be taken into consideration.
Great. So with that, I think we will end our panel. I want to thank our wonderful panelists for your wonderful insights and your perspectives on this topic. Clearly, there's a lot of questions, but it's very exciting to think through the opportunities that present themselves with the hybrid workplace. So thank you for your expertise, and thank you to our audience for tuning in today.